The installation of Management Studio, or SSMS, is a standalone EXE. The download is available from the internet and does not require an installation of the main SQL Server application. It is also no longer part of that service installation. The main application requirement is .NET 4.6 framework. This can be installed from SSMS, or the SSMS installation will handle the download and installation of this support library. Interacting with SQL Server components like the database engine and multiple instances is the main objective of SSMS. There's also an automatic check for updates, which might even happen in the demonstrations, but it still requires the interaction to be installed. This is also separate from the main SQL Server service component updates. So, Management Studio can be updated without updating the service components. Reporting and management improvements have come along in Management Studio. We will see new reports related to the new features of SQL Server 2016. And lastly, the new management items need to work with databases in Azure. If you have not started working in the cloud, you might want to set aside some time to start learning about this new feature. Before long, DBAs will need to have both skills, Azure and on-premise, to support SQL Server installations. So, what's new? Well, the installation can now run from the internet, and you can copy an ISO or an EXE, and the sharing of this file is now not needed, or copying it from one group to another group so they can share that installation file. You end up with many copies. And the best thing, of course, is this is free. Management Studio does not require the services to be installed. You can download it from the internet, and it just requires an agreement to the licensing terms. Here's the link, which is not exactly well formatted, to find the download, but if you do a Bing search, you can get there. In Management Studio, there's a new option to check for updates. This is on the Tools main menu, and this is new to 2016. But don't worry, Management Studio for 2016 still works with older versions. I have used it recently to manage a 2008 R2 instance as well as a 2012 and a 2014. Even the live query statistics will work with SQL Server 2014 if you have SP2, which is Service Pack 2. Here is the download page for SQL Server Management Studio for 2016. You'll notice in the download table there's a current version, which is 16.5.3, but there's also a release candidate for what's called vNext of SQL Server. So SQL Server is already in the works of releasing to certain people the next version of SQL Server. If I was to click on that download, I would get a message saying, do I want to run it or do I want to save it? I've already saved it to the download, so I'm just going to show you this window. It usually takes about 2 to 3 minutes to download it. But I'm going to go ahead and cancel that, come back to that window, and I already have it to run. I can run it or go to the specific directory and run it as administrator, or just run from this particular download. It's going to actually look at my current system to see what I need. You get a new screen of it actually bypassed some of the checks because the checks have already been implemented, and I really just have to click install to install it. By clicking install, I am saying that I acknowledge the license term and the policy statement. This will put on my machine the 2016 Management Studio. The new options in Management Studio appear under the Tools Options menu choice. The first that we're going to look at is Color Theme. It's like Visual Studio where they changed the theme of the overall colors of the IDE. The Visual Studio developers were kind of upset with the new version of Visual Studio that it automatically changed that. SQL Server actually changed it where it's something you go in and change, not something that comes on by default. So they've added these color themes, and there's two for Management Studio. And I think the uproar from the developers prompted the SQL Server team to give this an option rather than letting it default during the installation. There's also a check for Save Open Queries. There's a prompt, and this is when you have a T-SQL query window open and you close it, and then it either prompts you to save changes or not. There's an option now to get rid of that prompt, which is what some third-party interaction tools have done. And now the DBAs are going to get that with Management Studio. And it's also under the Tools option menu choice. The next one is something I really like, and this is the ability to search through the tree view. This is a great option, and if you notice in the window, there's analysis services. So we can look at just the analysis services features, and this flexibility in this option makes it so much easier because so many options are being added to SQL Server that it's hard to sort through all these particular new items. And also the one I like, by default it comes on, is highlight the current line. Last is this option that now a cursor, where your cursor is, the row, is actually kind of highlighted on the top and bottom. I like to be able to turn this on and off, but I really like it on by default because now I see where my cursor is. Here are the Tools Options menu that enables you to change configuration items for SQL Server Management Studio, or SSMS. The first one we're going to look at is the color theme. So by default, it sticks with the original blue theme. But if you want to change it to light, you can do there. And really, I don't like that, but it matches what's inside of Management Studio. So if you're a developer, you might want to stick with that. Under the Text Editor Generals option is the Highlight Current Line. This will actually show where your cursor is on a line in a query. So let's go look at that. We'll click OK, and we'll go query a database table. And what we're doing is right-clicking and selecting the top 1,000 rows from this particular table. Now sometimes you have a very large T-SQL statement, and what you'll notice now is there's a highlight on the line. So this comes on by default, but if you were to turn it off, you would not see that highlight line, and it's harder to see your cursors. So that's a pretty nifty option that SQL Server has implemented. The next is being able to search. So if I type in analysis, it'll show me all the analysis services features. But once it finds a tree level to go to, the remaining options under there are all displayed and are not filtered by your text. If you want to clear it, you just click the X button next to it. The last one that we look at is going to be the execution of a query, and there's a prompt to save unsaved T-SQL query windows when it's closed. You can turn this on or off now in order to either prompt you or not prompt you once you make a change to a particular T-SQL statement in a query window. With any new feature inside of SQL Server, Management Studio is going to need something in order to implement it. The first one we're going to look at here is something called Live Query Statistics. So, what is Live Query Statistics? Well, if you've done any performance tuning, you have usually used a query plan, either the estimated query plan or the actual query plan. Sometimes this is called execution plans. Live Query Statistics is this query plan in progress. You get to see the progress of the particular query. There's a new menu choice, which you see on the screen, and it's called Include Live Query Statistics. When you do this and you run a query, the execution plan pops up under a new tab called Live Query Statistics, and as you can see, there's some dotted lines. These dotted lines mean that is the part that is still running. So in this example, the clustered index scan on the top right has completed because the line is solid. But the clustered index scan on the bottom right is still progressing, and you can see in the parentheses 19% has been completed. So you got to follow along with the processing of the query, which is really, really cool. The other, and it's part of live query statistics, is something called the query store. The query store is encapsulated in a database, probably brought on by Azure databases, and now it stores the statistics and query plans within the database. This probably helps the DBCC clone database feature as well. You activate this on the database first and configure the historical retention. Once you do that, and after queries have been running for a while, you can right-click or drill into the database. You'll see a new folder called Query Store, and there'll be 4 related reports. To view the reports, you just double-click them, and the reports are about regression, resources, top consumers, and even ability to track a query by query plan ID. You can even force one of these query plans. Let's look at a demonstration of live query statistics. Here's a query on a very large table inside of the AdventureWorks database. If I have live query statistics turned on, which can be turned on from the query menu and clicking Include Live Query Statistics, or right-clicking the query window and clicking Include Live Query Statistics. Once I run it, you're going to see the live query below and the dotted line as the query runs. This helps us track what's actually going on inside of the query as it progresses through. I was actually running this on a SQL Server 2014 Service Pack 2 release, which it was set up but not in Management Studio. But if I drill in to the SQL Server 2016 instance and right-click on one of these databases, if I go to Task, I will see, Properties, I will see the area where we can enable the query store. By enabling this in a read-write fashion, I can tell it how to flush the data that's being collected and the interval to collect it. I also can set the max size stored in the database for this, and that flushing will clean it out once a SQL Server agent job runs. I also could tell it if there's stale query statistics, then go ahead after 31 days and remove that. So there's some configuration. There's even a button in the bottom right to purge all the query data, but we can track these statistics within a database rather than within an instance. Once I have that operational, my database will now have an additional folder with some reports. I can double-click Regressed Queries, and it'll give me a report. It'll actually highlight it from the resources used, what is the most expensive one. Sometimes some of the historical stuff gets in here, so you might have to wait till after you run some queries for a while. But you'll notice there's different reports to show you different things, as well as the query plan. You can also change the duration with the configuration of what you should regress for, how long, which I could say the last month, and actually get more data associated with that particular query store. There's an overall resource consumption, which will show me duration, execution count, logical reads, and CPU. A top resource consumer, which will kind of give me a graph of all the queries and the ones that are consuming the most resources. And then once I find a query plan I want to track, I can go to Track Plans and actually type it in here, and it'll find that particular query. Here, once I have multiple actual execution plans on a particular query, there's even a Compare Plans and a View Query button that will help you do more analysis on that particular performance-tuned T-SQL. With these new features come new reports. The first here is a transaction performance analysis. This can be used to track the performance of a database. kind of goes in with the query store and the live query statistics. This helps separate the tuning between a database and the overall instance. The next is a memory usage by memory optimized table. If you started using in-memory tables, which was introduced in SQL Server 2012, now there's a report to help you do an analysis of the memory consumed by that table. Even though there are DMVs and DMFs, which are data management objects, to monitor this, the report sums it up for DBAs. There's also a right-click analysis of a table for tables that might want to be set up as an in-memory table. There's a menu choice to do an analysis on the table to see if it's viable to be in memory. This is a comprehensive wizard that gives you all the details to see if in-memory can be used on the current structure of the table. In 2016, there are still some restrictions, so having a report detailing the failed restrictions for a table is extremely helpful. Let's look at some of these new reports in SQL Server 2016 Management Studio. If I right-click a database and go to the menu choice Reports and Standard Reports, I will see the Transaction Performance Analysis Overview. By clicking on this, I get two links, one to do an analysis on tables and the other to do an analysis on stored procedures. I'm going to click the tables analysis, and I will get a little graph that shows me some of the high gain versus minimum migration work of some tables. If I select a different number of tables to do the analysis, we get more on the graph. Anybody who's done analytical analysis knows the more variables, the harder it is to do this particular analysis. And that's really what's nice about this particular report. The second one is the optimized usage for in-memory tables. If we go back to reports, we'll see that I've used that report already. I can go to standard reports and get it, but I can also do it from the history. I'm going to click memory usage by memory optimized objects, and what I'm going to get is a pie chart that shows me that most of the usage is in indexes. Below that is a table that will show me the different tables and their indexes and how much space they take up and use in memory. You'll notice the index used memory is the highest area. So the index on these in-memory tables seems to be taking up more than the table itself. That's okay because it's in memory. Let's look at the analysis of doing an in-memory table. So if you have some existing tables already that you want to see if they're available for in-memory, we can right-click and go to the Memory Optimized Advisor. Once we select that, a wizard is going to come up, and with any wizard, you have an intro screen. We'll click Next, and then it's going to do an analysis of this table. You notice the red circles with the white X. First one tells me that an identity column is not supported with seed and increments, and that's the transaction ID. The other one shows me unsupported constraints, which in this case is a check constraint on the table. So even though I can't create it now, I can actually there are less restrictions in 2016. So I need to replace the identity and replace the check constraint on this table if I want to use it in memory. Some additional features that need support in Management Studio include Polybase. With Polybase, the installation is going to create some new databases on the SQL Server 2016 instance that it's supporting. You'll see these three new databases will have a prefix of DW. You also see this with data quality services as well as master data services. So to install some of these new features, you're going to have to perform maintenance on these new databases. Integration Services Catalog creates a SSIS DB, which is the same sort of requirement for maintenance. So be aware of these and know that you don't want to just delete, but you want to include them in your maintenance routine. Stretch Database will need to be managed in Management Studio, and it's here. You have to activate it or enable it on a database and then set up the stretch of the data. It's an advanced feature of SQL Server with Azure. The enable option is on the database, but there's more to it than just enabling. Azure needs some support as well, and we'll look at a task submenu to push data or deploy databases to Azure. You can deploy them to the Azure SQL database or an Azure VM. Mainly, these are just the deployment options. So, with new features, you need new templates and code snippets, and SQL Server Management Studio provides this correct syntax for a new feature or an existing one. The correct syntax is very important when implementing new features, and you want to look at these templates in order to understand the syntax. You can actually add your own and place them in a folder for your IDE. But the main objective is to learn this new T-SQL. With new features of SQL Server, this is one way to learn those new features. You can actually validate a script as well. So by being able to compare your T-SQL to a template helps tremendously. So now let's briefly review some of these additional menu choices for some additional options in SQL Server. The first is the stretch database. If we right-click our database and go to Task, you have the option to enable the stretch database. If you want to push this particular database to Azure, you go to Task, and then on the bottom, you have Deploy Database to Microsoft Azure VM and Deploy Database to Microsoft Azure SQL Database. So there's two different options there, and again, here's the stretch to enable that particular database. You'll be prompted with a wizard, and you need to go through the wizard and actually have a connection to an Azure instance. We're not going to go that far because it's more an advanced feature covered in a different section. I'm going to cancel this and go back, right-click to Task, and also look at the Deploy Database. Now, deploying is different than stretching. Stretching will share both. This will actually push the entire database to Azure. I'm going to cancel that, and I'm going to enable the templates. Under the View option, you have a Template Explorer. And this Template Explorer will usually appear on your right or a window not docked. And you'll notice there's different subfolders to do various things. So for instance, if we want something with the resource governor, we can look in there to how to configure the resource governor. If we need to look at something that is an Azure database, we can drill into Azure database and see how to create a database or drop a bit database in Azure. If we want to do partitioning, we can see the functions there, as well as database mail, roles, even change data capture, which is a neat feature of SQL Server.